We finally made our way to the last couple of chapters in the book, and so we're looking at the end of chapter 11, getting our way over to chapter 12. And so I want to kind of zoom through this again real quick and not spend a whole lot of time on it, just to kind of get our minds prepared for what we're talking about today, as well as kind of what has built us up to this point. But you remember, as we started off the book is about better. And it's looking at the New Testament church, it's looking at Christ, it's looking at the way of doing things today under the New Testament as a way of it being better. So that's been our theme of the book. And we started off the first 8 chapters deal with the comparison of Christ, of the New Testament, versus the prophets, versus angels, versus the Old Testament and the law system. And so we established over and over again that Christ is better. And that is our theme running throughout the book, that He is better. And remember, we were talking about, well, why does it continue telling us that He is better over and over and over again? Well, the question is, why would you want to do anything else? And so it's a book of encouragement is what we're finding out. It's a book of exhortation. It's encouraging these Christians. You keep moving forward, because look at how good we have it, and look at how Christ is better. They're about to go through some very difficult times, some very hard times, and so with that in mind, He is preparing them and giving them the encouragement they need to press on and move forward. And so the first 7-8 chapters deal with looking at Christ being a better leader. And then we've been looking at, for a few chapters there, we transferred over from directly looking at Christ to specifically looking at the New Testament. And we found the New Testament was a better covenant, and it's a better covenant in every which way. It's based on better promises, better sanctuary, based on a better final sacrifice. And that got us through about the end of chapter 10. But about halfway into chapter 10, we began looking towards the application. And that's really where you and I find ourselves today, is the application chapter of, because all of these things are true, now we can have a better life because of it. And so we looked at the end of chapter 10 going into chapter 11, and what we are looking at and defining is, what is faith? And really chapter 11 is telling us what faith is, what faith looks like. And so it leaves us without any question of our mind of what true faith actually is. And so I say that because whenever we look at what faith is, we find that faith is something that acts, doesn't it? It's something that works. It's something that does something in obedience. And so as we read through, and we made our way through a lot of these figures in chapter 11 and all of these examples of faith, and we find that all of them did something because of their belief. They had all caused them to be obedient to God. So we started all the way back, and we looked back at Abel, and we made our way down to where we left off a couple of weeks ago. Is at the end of chapter 11, there's a section there dealing with kind of he's basically saying, look, we can continue to go on and on and on about these people that have suffered, that have endured these things because of faith. And if you look back, and if we go through the end of about verse number 32, so look at verse number 32 in chapter 11. And what I want you to look at is in verse number 32 and following, you consider the positive aspects of faith. Let's think about that for a second. By faith, they were able to endure, and there were those who were able to, by faith, to do marvelous things. And as we look in, and of course, as you go back in verse number 32 and following, and we're having this list of people and all of the feats that they did. Verse 33, we're talking about those, they conquered kingdoms. They performed these acts of righteousness. They shut the mouths of lions. We talk about women receiving back their dead by the resurrection. But then you stopped at the end of that in verse number 35. And the first part of verse 35 kind of ends that, because of faith, people did marvelous things. But the other side of that is, all of that was not positive. Others, because of their faith, were able to endure truly terrible things here on this earth. And because of their faith, they were able to do it. And so we have the list in verse 35. That here, by faith, here's what they were able to endure. The first word we have there, and others were tortured. If you think back in Scripture, how many people can you think of in the Old Testament and the New who were tortured or caused themselves to be imprisoned or face torturings because of simply their belief? We have a great number of people, don't we, that were able to endure and go through such things. We have the other aspect of it, not accepting deliverance, that they may obtain a better resurrection. They refuse release. If somebody were to ask you the question of, if you would merely deny Christ, I'll let you go. You know, you think about the answer that we would be driven to give. That if you would deny God, if you would deny Christ, I'll let you go and maybe let your family go. Would you be able to refuse? As you read there at the end of verse number 35, they refuse such deliverance. Why? At the end of verse 35, it says that they might obtain a better resurrection. So all of these things, we're not looking towards necessarily the physical reward of faith. And that's really what this chapter is about. It's saying you're not going to be able to experience all of the good parts of faith. And none of these people were able to really see the true outcome of faith in this lifetime, but they knew that there was something better coming. You get to verse number 36 and you think about what these people went through. You have those who had went through cruel mockings. I mean, you think about the people that were mocked because of what they believed. I mean, you could start in the Old Testament. We could write a book about Elisha, Jeremiah. I mean, you think about all of these people who were mocked just because of what they believed. And then how about those who were scourged? We talked about a couple of weeks ago Jeremiah 20, verse 2. Scourged. Why? Because he was a messenger of God. Because he told them something that they did not want to hear. And so by faith, he was able to go through that. And then we have, how about those who were in bonds and imprisonment in there in verse number 36? Can you think of anybody that was imprisoned because of their faith? We probably have a list, don't we? In the Old Testament, you think back, well, you know, one thing about Jeremiah. Jeremiah certainly was. You could say Joseph certainly was because of his faith and because of who he was. And you think back, even in the New Testament, those who were in prison. I mean, right off the bat, Peter and John, right off the bat, go through that same problem. And so you have the problem of imprisonment. Why? Simply because of what they believed in. And what we really have to look at is, why were they in prison? Were they in prison because they were troublemakers, because they were thieves, because they were criminals? No. You know why? They were in prison because they had faith in God. And so as we look through these, how about those who were stoned in verse number 37? You think back to those who were stoned, and you think back to those who had undergone such problems. Zechariah, 2 Chronicles 24, verse 21, talks about him being stoned. Naboth, because of his faith, was stoned. And you think about in the New Testament, who was it that was stoned because of his faith? Stephen. Even Paul, remember, being left half dead, stoned as a result of his faith. And the other one, how about those who were sawn in sunder? A truly horrible method of execution where they were sawn in two. And tradition says that Isaiah was the one that underwent such torment. Why? Because he believed. How about those who were tempted? Well, we have a long list there. Perhaps no other greater temptation faced than by Job. You think about there with what they went through by faith. Killed by the sword, it says. Slain with the sword in verse 37. Who was killed by the sword? Do you think of anyone that we can think of? James, absolutely. James, what is that? Acts 12. Slain by the sword. Back in the Old Testament, you have the prophets plural of Elijah's time, killed by the sword. Why? Because they believed. How about those who wore skins for clothes, wore sheepskins and goat skins? The Old Testament representation of that being Elijah. Who in the New Testament wore sheepskins and these skins? John the Baptist, that's right. And then at the end of that verse, it says in verse 37, being destitute, afflicted, tormented. And then if you think about in verse 38, skip that first part in parentheses, and it goes on to say they wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. So of all of the things that faith can get us through, it can not only get us through the magnificent things that faith can provide and the triumphs, but it also allowed these people to get through some of the worst things we can imagine. And so if you and I stop for a second and we think about what faith is allowing us to do you think there's a reason the Hebrew writer is telling us about all of these hardships these people faced? What do you think is about to happen to the Christians of this age? And it's the same stuff, unfortunately. Unfortunately, they're about to go through some of the same exact hardships. And so the message for them is you keep moving forward. And at the beginning there of verse 38, that part in parentheses says, of whom the world was not worthy. The world was not worthy of them, and they endured why. And I want you to look at the end of verse 35. Verse 35 tells us, why did they endure? Well, they endured because they might obtain a better resurrection. They were looking ahead. They're not concerned about what happens in this world. They're not concerned about what happened in this life. No, they're looking ahead of that. Now, the end of verses 39 and 40 has been confusing, and it's not confusing when we put it in context. Let's read 39 and 40. It says, "And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect." Now let's break that down for a second. Verse 39, it says they obtained a good report through faith, but the end of that verse, it says they received not the promise. Now, what do you think that's talking about there? What do you think he's saying there? Well, here they went through all of these things because of faith, and yet they received not the promise.
Those people didn't have Jesus.
That's right. So we're looking ahead, and what is promised to them is they did not obtain what was promised. If we look ahead of that, God held off to provide Christians with something better. And there we loop in chapter 11, going back to why Christ is better. And so remember, as we talked about the forgiveness of Christ, and how because of his sacrifice, those who obeyed under the Old Testament were also forgiven because of him. And so we understand then in verse number 40, it says, God having provided some, there that word is again, better thing for us. What is that better thing for us? Forgiveness. Christ, the opportunity to have sin removed. And it says that they, without us, should not be made perfect. And so it's talking about there, look at what you and I are provided. So the question is, here's what they went through in faith. And here's all of these things, and look at how much better you and I have. They did all of that. They did not have Christ. They did not have that final sacrifice that he would make. They did not have the ability to go to the Father, as we found out as we were talking about Christ being our great high priest. They did all of that in faith, and so for us, why would we do anything less than live a life of faith? Because of how much better we have it today. And so looking at our lives as Christians, the question for you and I is, as we read through these things, they seem foreign to us. And we live in a time where we say peace is definitely something we experience as Christians, especially compared to what these people are about to face. But if those things came our way, would we maintain our faith? Would we still be able to believe, despite physical problems coming our way, physical pain, torment, punishment, whatever it might be, are we still those who would endure? Because at the end of verse 35, we're hoping for a better resurrection. We're hoping for something more than just this life. And so that's the question for you and I. Is our faith one that endures? Is it one that presses on? Is it one that's willing to stand up and stand out? And that's a question for you and I, all as individuals, to decide. So, any other thoughts through chapter 11?
Those examples are given to strengthen us as Christians because we don't know what we're going to face. And we hope that we're going to have enough faith that we would do what we should do, just like these examples, but we don't really know until it happens.
Yeah, that's true. And that is the true test then, isn't it? And I think, and Cheryl brings up a tremendous point, because you think about it, all of these examples are given to us. You know, there's sometimes we say, or we hear of others that, well, nobody's ever gone through this. And nobody's ever felt this way. Nobody's ever been through it. Here's a list of people that have, and have been through, whether it's the same thing or maybe worse scenarios, and we're still able to endure. So that's exactly what it is. You and I look back as Christians and we say, look at what they went through. Follow that example. Follow that example of what, and show what faith is. And that's how we're able to get through it. Absolutely.
Yeah, you know, you start to think too about what they went through and what we go through today in comparison. We don't really have the trials of our faith that those people had back in those days.
No, certainly not. And you know, you think about, at least where we're at in our country today, we might think, what's the worst thing that'll happen to us versus what would happen to them because of their faith. You know, you think of the worst thing that may happen to us, and the worst thing that probably has happened to most of us is maybe we get into an argument. You know, there's some people probably, and even it would become a lawsuit if we were fired because of our beliefs, and that's certainly something that may happen. Maybe we lose friends. Lawsuits are probably the biggest thing that we face, but you think about that in comparison to what they face, and truly are we to that point yet? No, we're not. And so as you and I look at and we understand what we have to go through, shouldn't that cause us to be even more bold? even more able to speak up and stand out about what we believe in. So let's transfer over to chapter 12. So chapter 12 now gets us into this idea of the endurance of faith. And this is kind of the nutshell of exactly what Cheryl said a minute ago about all of these examples and what they're for you and I. So read verses 1 through 3 with me of Hebrews chapter 12. He says, "Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest you be wearied and faint in your minds." Now you stop at the end of verse number 3, and you read verse number 1. He says, all right, now stop for a second and think about everything that I just told you. Think about everything we just talked about in chapter 11. We have so many examples of faith in so many different situations and so many different scenarios. And he says they're like a cloud. They're like a cloud of witnesses. There are so many that they're joined together. Maybe it's hard for us to distinguish just how many of them there are, but that's how many of them that there are. They're a cloud of witnesses. And so he says, okay, if we have all of these examples to guide us, and we have all of these people who endured to guide us, he says, let us lay aside every weight. So get rid of every hindrance that we have that might slow us down. Well, what is something that might slow us down to keep us from moving ahead? Sin, absolutely. So he goes on to say, and the sin which does so easily beset us. So you get rid of that weight that's going to weigh you down. Other things that weigh us down. We have sin probably being that main thing. One load that too many carry along with them, and we say that a lot of people carry along with them their past. By carrying along with them their past, they're never able to move forward to the future. That's what Paul says in Philippians 3, verses 12 through 14. To get rid of that, that's holding us back, and to look ahead to the future, concentrate on where you are going. And then he said, get rid of the sin. Because what does sin do? It says the sin, and the King James says, which does so easily beset us. What that means is it traps us. It's a snare. It's like a hazard. You're walking down the road, and what you're doing is you're actively tossing something in front of you to trip on. And so why would you continue carrying that if all you're going to do is cause yourself to eventually fall? And so imagine that you're trying to run a race, and you've got an armload of sticks, and you're throwing them out in front of you while still trying to run. He says, get rid of those things that trip us up, those things that snare us, those things that trap us. And so as you're running this race, the end of verse number 1 is interesting, isn't it? He says, let us run with patience the race that is set before us. That word patience is directly that idea of running with endurance. And so in this race, what is it that we must do? What is the most important part of this race that we run? That we finish it. That's right. And so run with endurance. And by the way, you notice that it is an endurance race. It's not a sprint. It's not over quickly. It's something that you pace yourself. You get rid of that weight. Now imagine as you're running a weight, what it would feel like if you could, you're holding in a backpack all of these weights, and imagine being able to put that aside. You take it off, and how much better you feel as you run. And then this bundle of sticks you're trying to carry, and you're tossing it in front of you, you get rid of that, and how much easier that race is to run. He said, get rid of all of those things that are going to trip you up. And imagine how much easier it's going to be to run that race. And so as you continue to run that race, and as you think about in verse number 2, here is where this aspect of the race is real. And here's the one example he waited to finally tell us about now. So chapter 11, we're missing one key example, aren't we? One key example who is the true pinnacle of what faith is. And verse number 2, it says, looking unto Jesus. And if you think about running a race, obviously probably the most important thing that you're looking down the way and seeing is the finish line. And you're looking and you see that there is a finish line there, that you know that there is an end to this race, that there is a finish line. Well, who are we looking at? We're looking at Jesus, and what does it say that he is? He is the author. What is the other thing that he is? The finisher of our faith. So he is the author. He is the perfecter of our faith. And so this idea means, and I want you to look at verse number 2. The word author there, the other way that you and I would translate that in the English language, how you and I talk, he is the pioneer. He's the trailblazer. He is the Lewis and Clark to the expedition you and I are going down. He's the one that already ran the race, has already gone through it. He is the founder. He is the one that is able and has already gone through it. And now he says, look, all you have to do is follow him. He's already been through it. He's already been through it. And so as you think about who our focus is and who we are looking at, as I go through my life, I'm not looking at me. I'm not looking at someone else. I'm not looking, and you notice you're not even looking at the other people that are running the race. You're looking at Jesus. That's our example. You're not piecing yourself based on where somebody else is doing or where they're at in their walk. You're not worried about that. No, you're looking ahead and you're running this race. So, as we get through this and you think about verse number 2, it's going to tell us a little bit about Jesus. It says that he, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross. Now, that's a very contradictory idea, isn't it? For the joy that was set before him, endured the cross. I don't know about you. I do not think that I would consider it a joyous thing to go to the cross, but he did it. Why? Because he is the finisher, he is the pioneer of our faith. And so he goes through, and I want you to think about verse 2, despising the shame. Despising the shame. You know, the cross was a shameful thing, wasn't it? To be crucified, to look at the cross. The cross, you know, you and I imagine we have the symbol of the cross, and we think about what the cross is. And you think about how shameful of a death it is. I've never seen anybody wearing an electric chair for a necklace. Have you? As an idea of what that shame is. And yet, we look at the cross and we look at it as victory and joy. It's not designed to be that way as in the Romans, but for the joy that it was, he endured the shame. He endured everything the pain that he went through for the cross. Why? And the question is, why did he do all of that? That's right. For the reward that you and I may have. The reward that you and I may have the opportunity to have. And so as I understand what he went through and what he did, in verse number 2, the end of that, what's one thing you don't do if you're running a race? Well, you probably don't sit down, do you? But where's Jesus at? And it says he is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. How can he sit down? That's right, because he's already run the race, he's already finished it. And so now you and I can look at that example, and we can look at what we have to do. And so read the end of verse number 3, or read verse 3 at the end of this idea. And it says, for consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest you be wearied and faint in your mind. And so think about what Jesus endured at the hands of sinners so that you and I do not give up. And I want you to think, here's a tremendous question for you and I, because we have something in verse number 1 of this, when it's talking about the weight. And then it says sin. It says that these are two different things. So here's a question for you and I. What are some weights, some hindrances that are not sins that can weigh us down? Fear, absolutely. Fear can absolutely weigh us down. We mentioned a minute ago the past of our lives. If we hold on to that to the point where we don't move forward to the future, it can weigh us down. You think about anything else. Hindrances in our life that are not sinful in and of themselves, but maybe get in the way. Money. You can do something in and of itself. Money itself is not a sinful thing. It's just an object. But it can be a weight. And it can be a problem if we're looking at that instead of looking at the race. When you think for a second and you stop and you think of these things that may get in our way if we're not focused on the right thing. And that's really the answer is if we're focused on something other than Christ, because it can be anything. It can be anything. I mean, it can be anything from a job to a hobby to money. It can be any of those things. As so long as they're a distraction from me finishing this race and having Christ as the priority, that can lead me to falling off course and eventually losing that race because I don't finish it. And so laying aside those things, looking to Christ in verse number 2 and 3, and finally moving ahead so that we do not give up. So any other thoughts through verse 3? Now, here as we go to verse 4, we're going to learn more about the audience that he's writing to that we've known at this point. We've learned a lot about them. We've learned that they're faithful to a degree, but they're still having problems, aren't they? Chapter 5 and 6 talked about how they were talking about some very mature things, and they weren't ready for it yet because they had stopped learning and stopped growing in knowledge. What they had done was, remember, they had gone back and they're just back on the milk. They're back on the basics. They never moved past that. And so we know quite a bit about them at this point. But now he's going to talk directly to them. Look what he says in verse number 4. It says, "You have not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin." So stop for a second and think about this. How bad is it for them at this point? He says, you're not yet there as far as the point, and especially to the hostilities that Jesus faced. Obviously, our hardships are not severe. We know, going back in verses 32 to 34 of chapter 10, we know some of them have suffered, but he says that to this point, they have not had to resist against sin to the point of shedding blood. So they're not there yet. Now look here in verse number verse number 5, the second part of this. He says, "And ye have forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as unto children. My son, despise not thou the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him." Now stop for a second here and think about how this contradicts so much of what the modern world tells us that our life as a Christian will be. And if we just look to the biblical example of this and verse number 5, are Christians promised a life that is free from hardship? No. Matter of fact, Matthew 5, if you're looking at the Sermon on the Mount, verses 10 through 12, tells us quite the opposite. Matter of fact, it tells us we're going to have difficulties. And these difficulties exist, well, from one sense, why do those difficulties exist? As an athlete and you're training for a race, you're going to face stress, aren't you? Why do you face stress? Usually to get better, to be able to endure better. And so he says there in verse number 5, and let's think about this for a second. The persecution in this world allows us to train to be better at facing what? Maybe the sin we face, maybe the problems of this life. I mean, it's designed there to allow us to be tested. And you think about something there that maybe we don't consider. If you read verse number 5, in chapter 12, you're going to see this word pop up quite a bit. This idea of chastening, or you and I may say disciplining. What are those things for? Whenever you discipline, what is it for? And what should it be for in its purest sense?
You follow the rules a lot better if you're chasing for something.
That's right. And so it's training us to do the right thing. Is you follow the rules better. You do what you're supposed to do. If instead of just being patted on the back the whole time whenever we do fail, no, there are consequences to those things that we have. And so this is not generalized affliction here that we're seeing and we're talking about in verse number 5. And so read verse 6 with me. And verse 6 contradicts so much of the idea of the world that it gives us, but consider what it means. It says, "For whom the Lord loves, he chastens, and scourgeth every son whom he receives." Now, here's a question for you. If we love our children, will we discipline our children? What happens if we don't? From a worldly perspective, from a physical perspective, what happens to the undisciplined child? What do they grow up to be? Better or worse as adults? Worse. Matter of fact, the majority of those who face hardships later in life are those who did not have a figure or those who had the home to discipline them. Now, that's not saying that's always the case, but certainly the great majority of it. And so as you think about verse number 6, God loves, or it says, "For whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives." Matter of fact, read verse 7 and think about this. "If ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chastens not? But if ye be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then are ye illegitimate and not sons. So if we think about this, and we understand the point of problems that we face in life, it is to allow us to grow stronger and better. And if you think about this, if he didn't love us, he would not allow us to face these things, and so we could not be better. But how does this work with the idea and the contradictory idea of the world that tells us that we'll never face hardship as Christians? I've heard that as a promotion for many people on the TV sets and on the radio, saying we'll become a Christian and all of those hardships in life will go away. That couldn't be further from the truth, though. And so if it's telling us these things, what should you and I take away from this through verse number 8?
Well, I see one thing scary about it is that, I mean, I've had a blessed life. And so am I far away, you know, without having any discipline of that. As I look at it from that standpoint, I have been not disciplined. I have been given a very chaste life. I mean, isn't that the word? We are right here, right now. And sometimes that scares me because it's so easy to fall away and not worry about it and everything else because there ain't a problem.
It can be, and certainly, I think that may be the temptation you and I face. That's probably the temptation of our time, is because it is so much easier, and maybe there is so little testing that takes place we consider versus what those of old face. That maybe it can be easier. And I think the answer to this is read verse 9. Verse 9 gives us the relationship to this, and it says, here's what we're talking about. Look at this in comparison to what we think about when we think about our life on earth and this idea of discipline. Verse 9 says, furthermore, we have had fathers of our flesh which corrected us. We gave them reverence. Shall we not much rather be in subjection unto the spirits and live? And so as you think about verse number 9, you're probably looking back, and those of you who had a father or mother who disciplined them, and you look back and say, well, they were right for doing that, and I'm glad that they did then. At the time, you probably didn't enjoy it, probably necessarily didn't think it was fun, but was it needful for us in order to grow and know what was right and what was wrong? And so you and I, we may not look at it in the moment, but as we look back to all of these things, it talks about in verse 7 and 8, if we are truly God's children, He's going to allow us to go through hard times. He's going to allow us to have these things, to be tested of these things. And He's going to allow us to do that because in order for us to grow, we have to have that test and we have to have that discipline. Now, chapter 12, it's kind of an interesting chapter in comparison to what we think about as far as what the world tells us. But think of it and how it applies to our life. Now, read verse number 10 with me. Read 10 and 11, and then we'll quit here for the day. It says, for they verily for a few days chastened us after their own pleasure, but He for our profit, that we may be partakers of His holiness. Now, no chastening for the present seemed to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. Verse number 11. So, here's a test for us this week, is to read through chapter 12 again, especially through verse number 11, and think about how this applies to our life. Think about the examples here that you and I can see we've experienced in our own, and find what this means in comparison to what we are talking about as far as what faith is. Now, I don't want us to forget the overall portion of what we're talking about is we're talking about faith. We're talking about a faith that works. We're talking about a faith that obeys. We're talking about a faith that does something. And so, with verse number 1 through 11 in our mind of chapter 12, how does that apply to our own faith? And so we'll talk about that more next week. Any final thoughts through verse 11 before we close for the day? All right, appreciate you all very much for your time and attention. We'll pick up in verse number 12 next week. Get a chance, read through chapter 12 and kind of think about that through verse 11, because we'll be able to talk about some of these things, how that directly applies to us, maybe what some of these chastening things, the ideas are specifically. So we'll pick up in